Good afternoon. This is Todd Davis with the Fourth and Boat Ark Church of Christ here in Pecos, Texas, coming to you again with a different question. Today the question is, who are we, humans, without God? And as I thought about that question, there were a lot of different possibilities that came to mind as to ways that we could answer that. So I figured I might hit on a couple of them, but I'm going to start with this stuff right here. Now, I don't normally drink Dr. Pepper products. But this one, I don't know if you can see, it's Dr. Pepper Zero Sugar. And the zero sugar is on there so that people like myself that are diabetic know that it's not going to be as bad for us as something that has all that sugar being pumped straight into our bodies. And that way we have a choice. But the fact still remains, zero sugar in the beverage, it's going to be something that is sweet, and it's an imitation to sugar. And in fact, a lot of science and research that's out there now tells us that what's in that to make it taste sweet, that imitation sweetener, is much worse for the body than the real thing is. It deteriorates the brain. It's tough on the liver. It can even cause things that are problems with the muscles that mimic, for example, Parkinson's disease if you have too much of it. And so when we get to an imitation, it mimics the real thing, but it's not ever exactly like the real thing. And so what is man without God? And the answer to that is, well, we have an imitation of a life if we don't have God. You see, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what it tells us in Genesis chapter 1. And by the time you get to the end of chapter 1, it says, God created man in His image. In His image He created them. Male and female, He created them. And so we were made in the likeness of God to have a relationship with God as part of the real genuine life, a life that has meaning and purpose not of itself, but only in our relationship with God and who God is. Galatians chapter 2, it does a really good job, and by it, Paul was writing to the church in Ephesus. Ephesus was a major city. It was right at the crossroads as you went from Europe over into Asia and on down to Africa, and it was home of the temple of the goddess of Artemis. And in fact, when you read through the book of Acts, you can read about a riot that they had there with the goddess of Artemis. But they knew what fake gods were. They knew what they looked like and how they behaved, because at the temple of Artemis, as it sat there, you had different sides to it. And over here was where the prostitutes were. And that's so you could worship Artemis by, well, being joined with a prostitute and worship the goddess of fertility. Over here was the meat market, where after the sacrifices were made, you could buy meat and sacrifice that had been made as a way of worshiping and honoring Artemis and her ability to provide. And so it went, and they knew what fake was. And so, as Paul's writing to the Ephesians, he said in chapter 2, verse 8, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it's the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." Now, I want to be sure that I say this right. We're not saved by our works. We're never saved by what we do. But because of who God is and who we are in God, we have meaning and we have purpose in our life. We have a specific calling. We're called to be like the real thing. We're called to imitate God, because in God and in God alone through His Son, Jesus Christ, we have a full life, not an imitation life. In God, we have completeness and we have unity. We have soundness of mind, soundness of thought, soundness of purpose that only He allows. The philosopher Nietzsche said, "God is dead. We have killed Him." And what Nietzsche was getting at wasn't necessarily the denial of a God, but he was getting to the point that when we fail to recognize God and who God is as the supreme ruler and the divine creator of everything, then the only thing left to fill that void is we ourselves. You see, we will always serve something. And if we don't have that higher purpose that Paul talked about in Ephesians chapter 2, what we wind up doing is putting ourselves on the throne, and we serve ourselves. There are reasons that they are saying, such as absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's because, well, without God, we have no hope other than to get everything that we can out of this moment in this life and to live for the here and now. And because of that, you wind up with people like Adolf Hitler who could, well, extinguish the lives of millions of people to better his own place in the world and to accomplish his goals. And all the people that bought into that system because they forgot who God was and who they were in God. Another philosopher who was the ruler of the Soviet Union said that religion is the opiate of the masses. It's the hope that people who are hurting and empty have. And he was absolutely right. Because in God we do have a hope and we do have a promise, and apart from God, everything else is meaningless. I saw a bumper sticker once and it said, "He who dies with the most toys wins. But he who dies with the most toys still dies." Apart from God, what happens to all that wealth and all the riches, all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into building an empty life? A zero life. It may have a flavor, it may have a distinction, it may have a little bit of zest, and it may seem very desirable, but in the end, it's nothing but a cheap imitation. It can never do what the real thing does, and it can never bring about the peace or the hope that only God can. You see, without God, we're nothing except a lump of clay. But in God, we can become more perfect until washed in His blood, He declares us righteous. And then through Jesus Christ, we can have life eternal with our God. That's real life. Thank you for joining me today. If you have questions, comments, or thoughts, please let us know. Some of them may be really deep, some of them may be a little bit silly, but we'd love to hear from you. And please join us anytime you can as we get together to worship on Sundays and Wednesdays.